The hymn was still echoing through St. Peter's Baptist Church when the first gunshot cracked through the sanctuary. October 15th, 11:47 a.m. 300 mourners packed into wooden pews, heads bowed in prayer for a 16-year-old boy whose life was cut short by gang violence. By 11:52 a.m., 6 more people lay bleeding on the church floor. A funeral became a massacre, a grieving father became a killer, and a sacred space meant for healing became a crime scene that would haunt Pittsburgh forever. This is the story of how 13 days of grief transformed a loving father into the very thing he sought to destroy. But to understand why David Morales opened fire in God's house, we need to go back to where it all began, 13 days earlier. October the 2nd, 6:30 a.m. Highland Park, Pittsburgh. David Morales' alarm clock screamed through the darkness of his studio apartment on Stanton Avenue. Steel dust still clung to his work boots from yesterday's 14-hour shift at the Edgar Thompson Works. At 42, David had spent half his life feeding molten steel into furnaces, his hands permanently stained black, his back bent from decades of hard labor. But every aching muscle, every double shift, every missed dinner was worth it for one reason: Miguel. His 16-year-old son was everything David Morales had never been allowed to be. Where David dropped out of high school to work construction, Miguel maintained a 3.8 GPA. Where David's own father had been absent, David called Miguel every lunch break just to hear his voice. Where David's childhood was marked by poverty and neglect, Miguel had college brochures spread across his bedroom floor and acceptance letters already arriving. "Morning, Pops," Miguel said, appearing in the kitchen doorway in his Lincoln High basketball warm-ups. At 6'2", he towered over his father but still hugged him like he was 7 years old. David studied his son's face. Miguel had his mother's eyes, warm brown, always smiling, full of possibilities. Maria had been gone 3 years now, lost to cancer that ate through their savings faster than David could earn it. But she'd left them with something precious: the belief that Miguel could be anything he wanted to be. "Got practice after school? Then I'm hitting the books," Miguel said, grabbing an apple from the counter. "Coach thinks scouts might show up for Friday's game." David felt his chest swell with pride. College scouts, his son. The boy whose biggest worry was whether to accept a basketball scholarship to Penn State or Pittsburgh. "I'll be working late again tonight," David said, hating the words as they left his mouth. "Double shift premium pays time and a half." "Dad, you work too much." Miguel's voice carried gentle concern. "When's the last time you took a day off?" David couldn't remember. But every extra dollar meant Miguel could focus on school instead of working. Every overtime hour meant college tuition wouldn't bury them in debt. "Soon," David lied. "After you graduate, I'll take a vacation." Miguel grabbed his backpack, pausing at the door. "Love you, Pops." "Love you too, mijo." David watched through the window as his son jogged down Stanton Avenue toward the bus stop, basketball shoes flashing against the concrete. He had no way of knowing that in 12 hours, Miguel would be dead. 3 miles south in the Riverside neighborhood, Trey Matthews was counting money. Stacks of 20s and 50s covered the kitchen table of his grandmother's house on Butler Street, the same house where he'd lived since his parents were murdered when he was 9 years old. At 24, Trey controlled 3 city blocks that generated $30,000 monthly in drug sales. The Highland Park crew had been his family, his protection, his livelihood since he aged out of foster care at 18. But now their territory was under siege. "They hit us again last night," reported Kevin Santos, Trey's lieutenant, sliding into the kitchen chair across from him. "Jerome saw them on Friendship Avenue, right where we do our Thursday drops." The Riverside boys had been pushing into Highland Park territory for 6 weeks now. What started as minor border disputes, dealers getting roughed up, product getting stolen, had escalated into something more dangerous. Both crews knew the 3-block stretch between Highland and Riverside was worth dying for. $30,000 a month, Trey said, his voice quiet but deadly. "That's what they're trying to take from us." Kevin nodded. At 19, he was Trey's most trusted soldier, abandoned by his mother at 12, bounced between foster homes until he aged out. Kevin saw the Highland Park crew as the only family he'd ever known. "What's the play?" Kevin asked, Trey studied the map spread across the table, marking territories with red and blue ink. Highland Park in red, Riverside in blue, the contested zone outlined in black. "They think they can pressure us out," Trey said. "Tonight we show them different." Jerome Wilson, the crew's enforcer, appeared in the doorway. At 26, Jerome had spent 4 years in state prison for armed robbery. He'd been released 8 months ago to find his old neighborhood completely changed. The Highland Park crew offered him purpose, money, and respect. 3 things the legitimate world had never provided. "The Riverside boys do their big supply run Tuesday nights," Jerome said. "They'll be carrying serious cash." Trey looked up from the map. "Where?" "Corner store on Highland Avenue, that old Pakistani man's place. They use it as a meeting spot every Tuesday around 10 p.m. The plan was simple. Hit them hard, take their money, send a message that Highland Park territory was not negotiable. It would be over in 5 minutes. Nobody would get hurt, except the intended targets. They had no idea that Miguel Morales would be in that store, counting change for his father's sandwich. October 2nd, 9:30 p.m. Edgar Thompson works. David Morales' back screamed as he lifted the final steel beam of his shift. 14 hours in the foundry. 14 hours of 1,000-degree heat, molten metal, and machinery that could kill you if you lost focus for even a second. But the overtime check would cover Miguel's SAT prep classes and new basketball shoes. His phone buzzed. Text from Miguel. "Working late at the library. Want me to grab you dinner on the way home?" David smiled, his first real smile in 14 hours. Even exhausted from studying, his son was thinking about him. "Surprise me," David texted back. "Love you." He had 43 minutes left to live in a world where his son was alive. Miguel Morales locked his locker at Lincoln High at 9:47 p.m. The library had closed at 9, but he'd convinced Mrs. Peterson to let him stay an extra hour to work on his college application essays. The Pennsylvania State University deadline was approaching, and Miguel's essay about growing up as the son of a steelworker needed to be perfect. He walked the 6 blocks from school to Highland Avenue in the crisp October air, thinking about Friday's basketball game and whether Sarah Martinez would say yes when he asked her to homecoming. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Can't wait for the weekend. Movie at 7? Miguel was typing his response when he pushed through the glass doors of Ahmad's corner store. Ahmad Nazir had owned the store for 12 years. He'd immigrated from Pakistan in 2005 with his wife and 2 daughters, dreaming of American success. The corner store wasn't much: cigarettes, sodas, lottery tickets, and basic groceries. But it paid the bills and put his daughters through school. His oldest, Fatima, was in her 2nd year at Carnegie Mellon University. His youngest, Aisha, was Miguel's age and went to Lincoln High. "Miguel," Ahmad smiled from behind the bulletproof glass partition. "How is the basketball season?" "Good, Mr. Nazir. We might make state this year." Miguel grabbed a Coke from the cooler and approached the sandwich case. "Can I get a turkey and Swiss? My dad's working late again." Ahmad began preparing the sandwich with practiced efficiency. "Your father works very hard. You are lucky to have such a dedicated man." Miguel nodded, pulling $17 from his wallet. His father had been working double shifts for 3 years straight ever since Mom died. The man never complained, never asked for anything, just worked himself to exhaustion so Miguel could have a future. Outside, 3 cars were converging on Highland Avenue. At 9:52 p.m., Trey Matthews parked his black Dodge Challenger in the alley behind the store. Kevin Santos pulled up across the street in a stolen Honda Civic. Jerome Wilson positioned his Ford F-150 at the corner, blocking the exit route the Riverside boys would use. The plan was military precise. The Riverside boys always met at exactly 10 p.m. to count their weekly take and plan the next day's distribution. Trey's sources said they'd be carrying at least $15,000 in cash, but Miguel Morales was taking longer than expected to pay for his sandwich. At 9:58 p.m., Miguel was at the counter, counting out exact change while texting Sarah back about their movie date. Ahmad was bagging the sandwich when the first Riverside boys' car pulled into the parking lot. "Keep the change, Mr. Nazir," Miguel said, handing over a $20 bill. "Thank you, my friend. Tell your father I said hello." Miguel pocketed the receipt and headed for the door, completely unaware that 3 armed men were climbing out of a black Escalade just outside. The collision of 2 worlds was 30 seconds away. At 9:59 p.m., Mark Big Mac Williams led his 2 lieutenants toward the store entrance. The Riverside Boys had controlled their territory for 8 years without serious challenge. These Highland Park punks thought they could muscle in on established business, but tonight would end that fantasy permanently. A Big Mac carried a .45 caliber Glock. His men, Dante Johnson and Rico Morales, each had 9mm pistols tucked into their waistbands. They expected to find Trey Matthews and his crew waiting inside, ready to negotiate or fight. They didn't expect to find a 16-year-old basketball player buying his father dinner. Miguel pushed through the glass doors at exactly 10 p.m., sandwich bag in one hand, phone in the other, completely focused on texting Sarah about their weekend plans. He walked directly into the middle of a gang war. The first shot came from Trey Matthews, firing through the store's front window at Big Mac Williams. The bullet shattered the glass and caught Big Mac in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a display of motor oil. Miguel dropped to the ground behind a chip rack as the store erupted in gunfire. Trey, Kevin, and Jerome had positioned themselves with clear sightlines into the store, but the Riverside Boys were returning fire from behind cars in the parking lot. Ahmad Nazir hit the panic button that connected directly to Pittsburgh Police Dispatch, then dove behind the counter as bullets punched through his bulletproof glass. Miguel tried to crawl toward the exit, but he was trapped in a crossfire between 2 groups of men who didn't even know he existed. Rico Morales, bleeding from a wound in his leg, emptied his clip toward the chip rack where Miguel was hiding. 3 bullets found their target. The first hit Miguel in the chest, puncturing his right lung. The second shattered his collarbone. The third tore through his abdomen, severing major arteries, and ensuring that even immediate medical attention wouldn't be enough. Miguel Morales died on the linoleum floor of Ahmad's corner store at 10:04 p.m., clutching a receipt for his father's turkey and Swiss sandwich. His phone lay beside him, displaying an unfinished text to Sarah Martinez. "Can't wait to see you, Tani." By the time the shooting stopped, Big Mac Williams was dead, Rico Morales was dying, and the Highland Park crew had disappeared into the night, thinking they'd only hit their intended targets. They had no idea they'd just signed their own death warrants. Before we dive deeper into the investigation that would shock even veteran detectives, if you're realizing this isn't just another true crime story, but something that changed an entire community forever, hit that subscribe button. We spend weeks researching cases like this, uncovering evidence and connections others miss. Trust me, what we discovered next will show you why this case still haunts Pittsburgh today. David Morales was in the foundry break room, still covered in steel dust and sweat, when his phone rang at 11:47 p.m. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the late hour made his blood run cold. "Mr. Morales, this is Officer Janet Woods with Pittsburgh Police. I need you to come to UPMC Presbyterian Hospital immediately. There's been a shooting involving your son." The words hit David like molten steel. Is Miguel? "Sir, I need you to come to the hospital. Can you drive, or should we send a unit?" David's legs gave out. He slumped against the break room wall, phone trembling in his hand. "Tell me, please, is my son alive?" Officer Woods's pause lasted 3 seconds, 3 seconds that stretched into eternity. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morales. Miguel was pronounced dead at the scene. I'm so very sorry." The phone clattered to the floor. David Morales's world collapsed into a single point of absolute darkness. His son, his everything, his reason for living, gone. Carlos Mendez, David's shift supervisor, found him 20 minutes later, still sitting on the break room floor, staring at nothing. Carlos had worked with David for 8 years, had watched him pour everything into raising Miguel alone after Maria died. "David, what happened?" "They killed him." David's voice was barely a whisper. "They killed my boy." Carlos drove David to the hospital, where Detective Francis Walsh was waiting with the preliminary report. Gang shooting. Wrong place, wrong time. Innocent victim caught in crossfire between the Highland Park crew and the Riverside Boys. "We're going to find who did this," Detective Walsh promised. "Miguel didn't deserve this. He was a good kid." David stared at his son's body through the morgue window. Miguel looked peaceful, like he was sleeping after a long basketball practice, but the 3 bullet holes in his chest told a different story. "Who?" David asked. "Who killed my son?" Detective Walsh consulted her notes. The Highland Park crew initiated the shooting. Trey Matthews, Kevin Santos, and Jerome Wilson. "We've issued warrants, but they've gone underground." David memorized those names. Trey Matthews, Kevin Santos, Jerome Wilson, the men who murdered his child. October 5th, 3 days after the shooting. David sat in the funeral director's office making decisions no parent should ever have to make. Casket selection, burial plots, flowers, music. Everything felt surreal, like he was planning someone else's tragedy. "Miguel was well loved," said Father Miguel Santos, the priest from St. Peter's Baptist Church, where the Morales family had attended since Miguel was baptized. "We expect a large attendance." Large attendance. David nodded numbly. Miguel's basketball teammates, his classmates, teachers who believed in him, college scouts who would never see him play. "The service will be Tuesday, October 15th at 11 a.m., Father Santos continued. "We've reserved the main sanctuary." David signed papers, wrote checks, made arrangements. But his mind was elsewhere, focused on 3 names Detective Walsh had given him. That evening, David drove through Highland Park and Riverside, studying the streets where his son's killers might be hiding. He knew these neighborhoods, had grown up in similar poverty, understood the desperation that drove young men to violence. But understanding and forgiveness were different things entirely. At midnight, he sat in his car outside Ahmad's corner store, staring at the crime scene tape and bullet holes in the windows. Someone had left a memorial, flowers, candles, a basketball signed by Miguel's teammates. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you," David whispered to the darkness, "but I'm going to make this right." Detective Frances Walsh had worked homicide for 12 years, but Miguel Morales' murder hit her differently. Maybe it was because her own son was the same age. Maybe it was because the boy had been completely innocent, just buying his father dinner. Maybe it was because David Morales' grief was so raw, so complete, that it reminded her why she became a cop in the first place. The Highland Park crew had vanished after the shooting. Trey Matthews' grandmother claimed she hadn't seen him in weeks. Kevin Santos' foster mother insisted he was visiting relatives in Philadelphia. Jerome Wilson's parole officer had no idea where he might be hiding. But Detective Walsh knew gang protocol. They would surface eventually, probably for the funeral. It was part of their code. Show up to pay respects, prove you weren't involved, maintain appearances in the community. "We'll have undercover officers at the service," she told David during their October 8th meeting. "If Matthews, Santos, or Wilson show up, we'll arrest them immediately." David nodded, but Detective Walsh noticed something troubling in his eyes. The grief was still there, but it was hardening into something else, something dangerous. "Mr. Morales, I need you to let us handle this. Don't try to take justice into your own hands." "Justice?" David's voice was bitter. "My son is dead because 3 animals decided to shoot up a corner store. Where's the justice in that?" "The justice is in making sure they spend the rest of their lives in prison. But that only happens if we follow the law." David stood to leave. The law didn't protect Miguel. After he left, Detective Walsh made a note in her file. "Father showing signs of potential vigilante behavior, requires monitoring." She had no idea how accurate that assessment was. David Morales had never owned a gun, never thrown a punch outside of high school, never considered violence as a solution to any problem. But grief has a way of changing people, and 13 days is a long time to plan revenge. He started with the internet, Highland Park crew, Riverside boys, gang territories, drug trade economics. He learned that the 3 blocks where Miguel died generated $30,000 monthly in sales. His son's life was worth less than a month's drug revenue. Then he hit the streets. David had grown up in these neighborhoods, knew people who knew people. Carmen Morales, his cousin, had done 2 years in state prison for armed robbery before getting clean. Carmen owed David money, favors, loyalty. "You sure about this, Primo?" Carmen asked when David explained what he needed. "This ain't you. You're not a killer. They made me one when they killed Miguel." Carmen sighed, studying his cousin's face. David looked like he'd aged 20 years in 1 week. "What do you need?" "Information, weapons, access." Carmen had connections, David didn't. Ex-cons, current dealers, people who moved in the shadows between legal and illegal worlds. Within 3 days, Carmen had provided everything David requested. A .38 revolver. Untraceable. Loaded with hollow-point bullets designed to cause maximum damage. Addresses: Trey Matthews' grandmother's house, Kevin Santos's foster family's apartment, Jerome Wilson's parole officer's contact information. Most importantly, confirmation that all 3 would attend Miguel's funeral. Gang protocol demanded it. Show up, pay respects, prove innocence through presence. "They'll be there," Carmen promised. "Question is, what you gonna do about it?" David cleaned the gun methodically, learning its weight, its balance, its capacity. 6 bullets, 3 targets. He practiced drawing and aiming until the motion became muscle memory. 13 days wasn't long enough to grieve properly, but it was more than enough time to plan a massacre. October 12th, 3 days before the funeral. David Morales quit his job at the steel mill, cleaned out his savings account, sold everything valuable in his apartment. If he survived what he was planning, he'd need money for lawyers. If he didn't survive, Miguel wouldn't need college tuition anyway. He wrote letters, one to Miguel expressing love and apologies for what he was about to do, one to his supervisor at the mill, thanking him for years of steady employment, one to Detective Walsh, explaining that justice delayed was justice denied. He sealed the letters but didn't mail them. Not yet. October 13th, 2 days before the funeral. Father Santos visited to discuss the service details. Miguel's basketball coach wanted to speak. Sarah Martinez, Miguel's girlfriend, had written a poem. The school choir would sing Amazing Grace. "Your son touched many lives," Father Santos said. "This service will celebrate that legacy." David nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere. Calculating sightlines in the church sanctuary, estimating crowd size, planning his approach and escape route. "Will you be speaking at the service?" Father Santos asked. "I'll have something to say," David replied. October 14th, 1 day before the funeral, David's last normal day alive. He visited Miguel's grave, freshly dug, waiting for tomorrow's burial. He brought his son's favorite candy, a Snickers bar, and left it on the headstone that read, "Miguel Morales, beloved son, 2007-2023, gone too soon." "Tomorrow, mijo," David whispered. "Tomorrow I make this right." That evening, Carmen came by with final intelligence. "They'll all be there. Trey Matthews is driving down from Erie where he's been hiding. Kevin Santos never left the city. He's been staying with his aunt in Lawrenceville. Jerome Wilson's been in Cleveland, but his mother called him home for the funeral." "You sure they'll show?" "Gang code, Primo, they have to show. Proves they respected the kid, proves they weren't involved. It's like diplomatic immunity." David laughed bitterly. "Diplomatic immunity in a church at my son's funeral." "It's not too late to change your mind," Carmen said. "Turn the gun over to the cops. Let the system work. The system failed Miguel. I won't fail him." After Carmen left, David sat at his kitchen table, cleaning the .38 one final time. 6 bullets, 3 killers, 3 innocents who would die in the crossfire. He knew that was inevitable, but grief had calcified his moral compass. Collateral damage was acceptable if it meant his son's murderers died too. At midnight on October 15th, David Morales knelt beside his bed and prayed to a God he was about to betray in the worst possible way. "Forgive me," he whispered, "but they took everything from me. Tomorrow, I take everything from them." He had 11 hours left before he became the monster he was trying to destroy. If deep investigations like this, where we take you inside the evidence rooms, show you the overlooked details, and give you the complete story that took months to piece together, are what you want to see more of. Subscribe now, because next week's case involves a mother who discovered her daughter's killer was living next door for 15 years. But first, you need to see how justice finally caught up with everyone involved in this tragedy. October 15th, 10:30 a.m., St. Peter's Baptist Church. 300 people filed into the sanctuary, creating the largest funeral attendance in the church's 40-year history. Miguel Morales' basketball teammates served as pallbearers, their Lincoln High warm-up jackets a splash of blue and gold against the somber crowd. Sarah Martinez sat in the front row, clutching the poem she'd written about her first love. At 16, she'd never imagined attending a boyfriend's funeral. Behind her, Miguel's teachers from Lincoln High whispered about college scholarships that would never be awarded, potential that would never be realized. Detective Frances Walsh positioned herself near the back door, scanning faces for the 3 men she'd been hunting for 13 days. 2 undercover officers sat in the middle pews, ready to make arrests if necessary, but they were looking for gang members trying to blend into a mourning crowd. They weren't prepared for what David Morales was about to become. At 10:45 a.m., David entered through the main doors wearing his only suit, the same black ensemble he'd worn to Maria's funeral 3 years earlier. He looked like any other grieving father, clutching a tissue, shoulders slumped with grief. Nobody noticed the .38 revolver tucked into his waistband, hidden beneath his jacket. David surveyed the sanctuary with tactical precision. Trey Matthews sat in the 3rd row, wearing a respectful black shirt and tie, looking every inch the remorseful community member. Kevin Santos was positioned near the side aisle, close to the stained glass windows depicting Jesus with children. Jerome Wilson stood by the back door, directly in front of Detective Walsh. All 3 killers, all within range, all about to pay for Miguel's murder with their lives, and all surrounded by innocent people who had come to mourn a boy they loved. Father Santos began with a prayer that echoed through the packed sanctuary. Heavenly Father, we gather today to celebrate the life of Miguel Morales, taken from us far too soon. We ask for comfort for his father David, strength for his community, and justice for those responsible for this tragedy. Justice. David almost smiled at the word. Justice was coming, delivered by a father's love and a loaded gun. Coach Williams spoke first, describing Miguel as a leader on and off the court. He was the kid who stayed after practice to help younger players, the one who made sure everyone felt included. Miguel Morales was going to change the world. Sarah Martinez read her poem through tears. You were my first love, my best friend, my future dreams all wrapped in basketball shoes and that smile that lit up every room. David watched his son's killers during the testimonials. Trey Matthews kept his head bowed respectfully. Kevin Santos wiped fake tears from his eyes. Jerome Wilson nodded along to the stories about Miguel's character. The hypocrisy was unbearable. These animals had murdered an innocent boy, then showed up to his funeral pretending to mourn. Gang protocol or not, their presence was a desecration of everything Miguel represented. At 11:30 a.m., Father Santos invited anyone who wanted to share memories to approach the microphone. 3 classmates spoke about Miguel's kindness. His math teacher described his dedication to learning. A neighbor thanked him for shoveling her sidewalk every winter. Finally, Father Santos looked toward the front row. David, would you like to say something about your son? This was the moment. David stood slowly, feeling the weight of the .38 against his spine. 300 pairs of eyes focused on him, expecting words of grief and remembrance. He walked to the front of the sanctuary, passing within arm's reach of Trey Matthews. For a split second, their eyes met. Trey offered a slight nod of condolence, killer to victim's father, maintaining the pretense of innocence. David reached the microphone and turned to face the congregation. His son's casket lay just below him, covered in flowers and basketball memorabilia. Miguel's Lincoln High jersey was draped over the mahogany wood. My son Miguel was everything good in this world, David began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He was kind, smart, funny, respectful. He called me every day during lunch break just to check in. He had dreams of college, of playing basketball at Penn State, of becoming an engineer like his mother always wanted. The congregation listened in respectful silence. Sarah Martinez sobbed quietly in the front row. Detective Walsh made notes about David's demeanor, still concerned about his potential for violence. "Miguel never hurt anyone," David continued. "He walked 6 blocks to buy his father dinner after a 14-hour shift. He was texting his girlfriend about weekend plans. He was counting change at a corner store counter when 3 cowards decided to have a gunfight over drug money." David's voice grew harder. Several congregation members shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't heading toward forgiveness and healing. 13 days ago, those 3 cowards murdered my son. They took everything from me in that store. David's eyes found Trey Matthews in the 3rd row. "Today, I take everything from them in God's house." The .38 revolver appeared in David's hand, faster than most people could process. Detective Walsh reached for her service weapon, but she was 60 feet away and surrounded by panicked civilians. David's first shot hit Trey Matthews in the chest, sending him sprawling across the wooden pew. His second shot shattered the stained glass window where Kevin Santos was trying to take cover. Chaos erupted in the sanctuary. Screams echoed off the vaulted ceiling as 300 people stampeded toward the exits. Children cried for their parents. Adults dove under pews. The peaceful funeral service became a war zone in seconds. Kevin Santos drew his own pistol, a 9mm Glock he'd carried to the funeral for protection. Gang code said, "Show respect at funerals," but it didn't say, "Come unarmed." He returned fire toward the altar, his shots going wide and punching holes in the church wall. Detective Walsh fought through the panicking crowd, trying to reach David Morales before he could kill again. But terrified mourners blocked every path, and she couldn't risk shooting with so many civilians in the crossfire. David's 3rd shot found Kevin Santos in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the church organ. Kevin's return fire went wild, striking Margaret Thompson, a 72-year-old grandmother, who had taught Miguel in Sunday school when he was 8 years old. Jerome Wilson had reached the back door when David's 4th shot caught him in the spine. He collapsed against Detective Walsh, blood spreading across his white shirt, paralyzed from the waist down but still alive. 3 gang members down, 2 bullets left in the cylinder. But David's war wasn't over. In his grief-maddened state, anyone who had shown his son's killers even basic human courtesy was complicit in Miguel's murder. The funeral director who had shaken Trey Matthews' hand, the church usher who had given Kevin Santos a program, the congregation members who had nodded politely when Jerome Wilson offered condolences. David's 5th shot hit Nathan Davis, Ahmad Nazir's nephew, who had attended the funeral to support Miguel's family. Nathan had been in the corner store the night of the shooting, had seen Miguel die, had given statements to police. Now he bled out on the church floor, another innocent victim of David's twisted justice. The 6th and final bullet was meant for Father Santos, the priest who had welcomed everyone, including killers, into God's house. But Detective Walsh finally broke through the crowd, tackling David just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went high, embedding itself in the church ceiling instead of the priest's heart. By 11:52 a.m., 6 people lay bleeding in St. Peter's Baptist Church. Trey Matthews and Kevin Santos died at the scene. Jerome Wilson survived but would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Margaret Thompson died 3 days later from complications related to her gunshot wound. Nathan Davis survived after 6 hours of surgery, but would walk with a limp forever. Father Santos lived because of Detective Walsh's heroic intervention. David Morales offered no resistance when the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He knelt beside his son's casket, empty gun beside him, whispering apologies to the boy he'd failed to protect. His final words before being led away: "They took everything from me in that store. I took everything from them in God's house." The Pittsburgh media called it the Funeral Day Massacre. 6 shot, 3 dead, multiple families destroyed by one father's quest for revenge. St. Peter's Baptist Church closed for 3 months while crews repaired bullet holes and replaced blood-stained carpets. David Morales was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and multiple weapons violations. His trial lasted 6 weeks, with prosecutors arguing that grief didn't justify mass murder and defense claiming temporary insanity brought on by extreme emotional disturbance. The jury deliberated for 18 hours before reaching their verdict: guilty on all counts. David Morales was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years for the attempted murder charges. Detective Frances Walsh testified at the sentencing hearing about the investigation that consumed her life for months. Miguel Morales was an innocent victim of gang violence, but his father's response created 5 more innocent victims. Violence doesn't honor the dead, it just creates more death. Ahmad Nazir, the store owner who witnessed both shootings, spoke about the impact on his community. 2 terrible nights destroyed so many lives. Miguel was a good boy who deserved better. But the people shot in that church, they were good people too. They came to mourn, not to die. Sarah Martinez, now 19 and attending Carnegie Mellon University on an academic scholarship Miguel had inspired her to pursue, wrote a victim impact statement that was read in court. "I lost the boy I loved in that corner store. Then I lost the man who was like a second father to me in that church." David Morales' pain was real, but his solution was wrong. Miguel would have been horrified by what happened at his own funeral. The Funeral Day massacre sent shockwaves through Pittsburgh's gang community. The Highland Park crew disbanded within weeks, its surviving members either arrested or fled to other cities. The Riverside Boys followed suit, their leadership decimated, and their territory no longer worth the risk. But the violence left deeper scars on the Highland Park neighborhood. Property values plummeted, businesses closed, families moved away. The corner store where Miguel died remained boarded up for 2 years before being demolished and turned into a memorial garden. Dr. Patricia Williams, a criminologist at University of Pittsburgh, studied the case for her research on vigilante justice. David Morales represents the complete breakdown of faith in institutional justice. When people believe the system has failed them utterly, some turn to personal vengeance. But vigilante justice never brings peace. It only perpetuates cycles of violence. The case prompted Pittsburgh police to establish new protocols for protecting grieving families from potential retaliation. Detective Walsh, now retired, runs training seminars for law enforcement on recognizing signs of vigilante behavior in victim families. "We have to do better at supporting people like David Morales before their grief turns them into killers," Walsh explains. The system did fail Miguel. Those gang members should have been arrested before they could attend his funeral. But David's response made everything worse. Jerome Wilson, paralyzed from David's bullet, served 3 years in prison for his role in Miguel's murder before being released to a wheelchair-accessible cell in a state medical facility. At 29, he requires round-the-clock care and will never walk again. "I deserve what happened to me," Jerome said in a rare interview from his facility. "We killed an innocent kid over drug corners, but them people in that church didn't deserve it. They was just trying to bury a boy." Nathan Davis recovered from his wounds, but left Pittsburgh permanently, moving to Seattle where his uncle runs a restaurant. He still walks with a limp and suffers from PTSD triggered by church bells and funeral music. Margaret Thompson's family established a scholarship fund in her memory for underprivileged students pursuing education despite difficult circumstances. The same path Miguel Morales had been walking when his life was cut short. Ahmad Nazir rebuilt his store at a different location, but installed bulletproof glass throughout and hired armed security guards. "I came to America for safety," he said. "Now I live behind bulletproof walls. This is what violence gives us, fear where there should be community." David Morales is currently serving his sentence at SCI Graterford, a maximum security prison outside Philadelphia. Now 45 years old, he works in the prison library and has earned his GED, the education he never completed because he started working to support his family. In a written statement provided through his attorney, David expressed remorse for the innocent victims of his rampage. "I thought I was honoring Miguel's memory by killing his murderers. Instead, I dishonored everything he stood for. My son was kind, peaceful, loving. I became the opposite of everything he represented." Prison counselors report that David suffers from severe depression and has attempted suicide twice. He receives regular visits from Father Santos, the priest he nearly killed, who now serves as his spiritual advisor. Forgiveness is not about forgetting, Father Santos explains. It's about choosing healing over hatred. David Morales destroyed many lives that day, including his own. But even he deserves the possibility of redemption. David has never requested a visit from Miguel's friends or Sarah Martinez. "I took away their chance to say goodbye properly," he wrote. "I don't deserve their forgiveness, and I won't ask for it." The memorial garden that replaced Ahmad's corner store features a plaque honoring Miguel Morales and the victims of the funeral shooting. It reads, "In memory of those lost to violence and in hope that future generations will choose peace over vengeance." Every year on October 2nd, the anniversary of Miguel's death, Sarah Martinez visits the memorial garden to leave flowers and remember the boy she loved. She's now a social worker specializing in helping families affected by gun violence, turning her tragedy into purpose. Miguel believed in solving problems through kindness and hard work, Sarah says. "I try to honor that every day by helping other families avoid the path David Morales chose. Violence creates more victims. It never brings peace." The Funeral Day Massacre remains one of Pittsburgh's most tragic examples of how grief can transform love into hatred, victims into victimizers, and sacred spaces into crime scenes. 6 people were shot, 3 died, and an entire community was traumatized because one father chose vengeance over justice. Miguel Morales was buried 3 weeks later in a private ceremony attended only by immediate family. The public funeral he deserved was forever tainted by the violence that erupted over his casket. His father's quest for justice became the very injustice it sought to remedy. David Morales will spend the rest of his life in prison, haunted by the knowledge that his son, the boy who called him every day during lunch break, who dreamed of college and basketball scholarships, who died buying his father dinner, would have been ashamed of what happened in that church. The Highland Park and Riverside gang war that killed Miguel lasted 6 weeks and claimed 4 lives. The cycle of violence David Morales perpetuated has lasted 3 years and shows no signs of ending, because violence, as Miguel's community learned too late, never honors the dead. It only creates more death. This has been the complete investigation into the Funeral Day Massacre. Next week, we're examining the case of Linda Morrison, a mother who spent 15 years unknowingly living next door to her daughter's killer. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that story. And remember, justice delayed may be justice denied, but vengeance is never justice at all.